What if the stories we tell could reshape our cities, mend cultural divides, and prepare us for a future shaped by climate migration? In today's episode of the Storytelling Movement podcast, we sit down with Jason Winn, an expert in narrative infrastructure. He explores how community stories, especially those tied to land and place, can influence public policy, bridge political divides, and preserve authenticity in the age of AI. If you care about community, culture, identity, or the future of storytelling in the digital age, this episode is for you. Jason, can you speak more about how storytelling works in convincing people to share their story?
I think that the conversation you want to have is starting with the question of how do you influence your community if you don't tell your story? By definition, if you don't speak, you're not heard. And one of my favorite authors, Hannah Arendt, said the fundamental human right is to speak and act in meaningful ways. And she equated acting with speaking, that you can influence how people are going to engage with their community by convincing them of something. And if you're in the mode of convincing someone of something, that means you're telling them a story. You're making the narrative happen. So if a community member is reticent to get involved, then the question that you want to ask them very simply is, do you care about how your community will change? If you do care, you just need to share your own life, your own story. I offer anonymity as an option for every interview I do. And because some people need to tell challenging stories, they don't want the risk of reprisals. It vastly increases their political potential if they will name names and use their own name as well. But that, of course, is at the function of all politics, a scary thing to do. It is risky. That is what it means to be in politics, is to put yourself out there, to stand forward and say, this is what I believe, this is who I am. And on the arc of the Aristotle's perspective of ethos, pathos, etc., what they're talking about is if you are telling your tale, your ethical tale, what happened to you, if someone's going to challenge that, they are literally calling you a liar. That is a very bold thing for someone to do. And that's why oral histories have one of the highest degrees of ethos, the highest degree of ethical expression, because it is your memories. It's your memories of who you are. It's where you come from and what you remember, what you live. And that is the least likely to be attacked in the political environment. So I offer that as a point for people to think about, is like someone would have to really they would demonstrate their own ignorance or their own bias by attacking you, recording your own memories. So even if they did, that would be so easy to dismiss. They were clearly so overrun by their bias or their propaganda that everyone's going to ignore them.
A lot covered there. And I imagine that anonymity and protecting sources would appeal to those who are interested in journalism too. And for podcasters, helping to encourage people to tell stories. I have had students who have interviewees who are not comfortable on camera. So they're using tools to mask the face and sometimes the voice too, just so that that person feels comfortable sharing their stories. Can you speak a little bit more to helping people who are wanting to be anonymous tell their stories and how you might encourage them to share their narratives and connect that to action on the ground? Tell us a little bit about the tools you're using to sell these kinds of folks who need to tell their stories but are holding back, obviously, for all sorts of reasons.
A most important step that you have to take isn't so much with the participant as it is to be able to have a process defined ahead of time. I operate within the European Union, so the GDPR is the go-to reference that guides our intellectual property issues. The issue isn't quite as big a deal with that, but when you develop your consent form and you develop your process for making that possible, one of the most important things in there is to guarantee the right of takedown. So that when you're talking to somebody, say, guarantee with a phone call or an email, I will make this disappear forever. And no one, not even the government, will get a copy of it. And that is absolutely a guarantee I offer within my consent form, so that they check a box going, I understand that I have your phone number, I have your email address, and I can contact you at any time today or even 10 years from now and have a takedown order actually executed on my offering for this project. That sets up a framework of trust that also has a whole lot of value if you're working with an ethics board with a university that has a secondary review for that kind of process. They vetted it and made sure that you're going to be honoring that. Working within the European Union and their grant structure, 1/6 of everything you write for a grant proposal is going to be what is your ethical approach. Easily 7 to 8 pages of a grant proposal will be describing how you're going to approach the personal property rights, how it's going to be looked at from the post-processing, who is going to be post-processing, what server is it going to be stored on, who's going to have access to that server. All of those need to be laid out ahead of time. So that's a preparatory work. And you offer that. And if someone says they can't talk, at a certain point, you're just going to go, I will let your judgment stand. And we won't include your voice, and let that be honor their desire not to engage, and ask them, can we at least include you when we're finishing up and share with you the results? We would like to be able to at least let you see what we've done, even though you haven't participated. And if you want to participate in the future, then you'll know what we did. You'll see.
Beyond the personal satisfaction of sharing your story, there's also real actions that could happen as a result. Can you speak to the power of telling stories that are geotagged, that are spatial, that can help create change? Do you have any stories where change happened or where goals were reached as a result of this often difficult kind of work?
One of the things that we're playing with right now is a cafe concept that is based on a story that collected a story from a particular neighborhood. And this island of Cyprus has actually got an ethnic division between the Turk Cypriots and Greek Cypriots. And it's one that has gone back 500, 600 years. It's not a new thing. Ever since the Ottomans actually took the island away from the Crusaders, who had taken it away from the locals. And so this island's always been in flux. But between the Turk Cypriots and the Greek Cypriots, there's always been a lot of friction. And one of the stories we got was some older gentlemen recounting how they used to play marbles in a particular empty lot that's still empty to this day. And they would play marbles with each other, and the Greek children would stand up on the edge of the empty lot and watch the Turk children play marbles. But they weren't allowed to play marbles with the Turk children because their parents told them, you're not allowed to play with the Turk Cypriots. And this incredibly simple narrative said, okay, how could we leverage this? How could we transmute this just tragic thing of children not being allowed to play together, which is the most natural of things, and turn it into something that honors the story, honors that division, but transmutes it, turns it into something different. This particular neighborhood has a high need for additional cafes. And so the proposal was, okay, let's make a new cafe and just this simple. Let's name the cafe Losing Our Marbles Together. Leverage the narrative and make it a comedic result. Bring the communities together on the absurdity of racial bias or religious bias, and make it into a new place where people can share a cup of coffee.
I'm imagining the kind of applications that we could take here in America, because I think that as we enter a political season, many of us will feel like we are losing our marbles too. You have any other stories like that that help to bridge that divide? I imagine that in your work, you've seen bridges built as a result of story. Can you share some of those stories about the bridges that happened as a result of this hard labor, just like the losing our marbles story?
Let me dive into the theory first so that there's some utility here. There's some references. The notion of a tragic story versus a comedic story is the starting point for this process, where normally if you're going to look at a archetypical hero story, someone is going to come out badly, someone's going to come out ahead. It's a win-lose, so it's a zero-sum game. This is all too typical in political discourse, is zero-sum. And this has gotten even more rancorous within the modern political environment as social media has really geared us to think in those and to silo, into win-lose, kind of scenarios. And that is not how politics actually succeeds. That's how conflicts happen, not politics. Politics is supposed to be the substitution for conflict. We got together as communities to not beat each other in the head. We got together as communities to work together. And so the getting away from the mindset of zero sum is about looking at what are the macro narratives, particularly within the political realm or within the silos of social medias, and look at what are the macro stories that are being pushed, and then find ways to subvert them. The principal story, the principal powers, those are the elements that, if you look at Shakespearean comedies, the whole point is to focus on the power structure that's in play, and then as a community, find a clever way to subvert so that not everyone gets everything they want, but everyone gets what they need. That is typically how a comedy plays out as a narrative. And when you're consistently being shown tragic narratives and someone's saying, well, what do we do about this? The first thing you have to do is transmute tragedy into comedy. And that is an exercise. You have to break it down, map it out. Who are the actors? Who are the players? What is the power dynamic? Make a chart and graph that. Once you can then find a point of leverage where people can be asked to work together to do something that is surprising, off character, breaks cultural norms probably, and therefore we call that comedy. It causes surprise. And if you do it lightheartedly and you do it without presuming that you're going to defeat the other side, but in fact invite them in, then you're taking a whole nother level of approaching working with political communications, working within the politics. The biggest question always comes down to macro stories these days with working with the environment. How can you subvert the powers that be that are, of course, financially invested in taking advantage of the environment? The standing reserve, taking advantage of this business that moves into a situation that wants to bring their own brand, or a franchise that's going to import a brand. And what's that brand from Seattle have to do with your local community? Well, the simple answer is nothing whatsoever. And that importing of a story is aggressive. You're actually demanding based on property rights. In that case, demanding based on property rights that you have the right to open your business and name it whatever you want, and thereby ignore everyone's memories about that location, about that street corner. And it takes an extra half hour's effort. If the new business owner can be made aware of the variety of stories in an environment, maybe you don't name the hotel Hilton. Maybe you look and you see that was someone's grandpa's orchard, and you can name your new hotel Grandpa's Orchard Hotel. And in this respect, you bring forward people's memories, and you have to change cities. That's not an option. You have to evolve them. But that doesn't mean you have to eject and dismiss people's memories, because it's a little bit of destroying people's sense of identity and their sense of home as urban renewal takes place. So that becomes the request that you go to a developer, that you go to a policymaker, say, can you just leverage the narratives that came before so that we have that sense of continuity, particularly in a disaster environment? We know things are going to change, but let's start from the stories so that there is a degree of continuity, so that we don't have always new all the time. I don't know where I am because my entire environment is anonymous, and international brands or these national brands that have no connection to how I grew up here and what I remember, so that I can actually see my community is evolving with how I remember.
I love how you just connected the personal with the political, with identity, and how identity and culture get mixed up. It's so fun to think about how we can preserve the past and use memory and use identity to create a better culture, to create a more interconnected culture that maybe is kinder, maybe is better for these cities. And I know that you're an expert at creating story infrastructure. Can you speak to how your work specifically advances that goal? How does mapping someone's story actually lead to these kinds of outcomes of a kinder future with stories preserved and memory intact and identity and intercultural communication thriving?
The key distinction that a lot of people want to jump to is that I'm going to be making oral histories political action. It's not exactly like that. As I'm making a spatial archive with stories, the use of them, how they're brought forward, honestly, we can't anticipate. That is one of the brilliant parts of it. It takes these, for example, working with an existing archive that is buried in a library website in an audio-only format. So the only way you know what is on it is to listen to the whole thing. And only then do you have any idea it's relevant. Instead of holding that and having it at best searchable by keywords, we distribute all of that with no bias on the land itself. Now the land is the archive. So when we have questions that are specifically related to land use or to policy in a particular location, you can reference this subjective data. We don't know what those are going to be. That's not the important point. The important point is that in the future, going forward, that opportunity is there. Even the mandate is there to say, have you considered the community stories? And there's always been a technical disconnect. Well, we had public engagement process. We invited people to come down and speak for an hour. Boy, how lame is that? That's maddening to think that our public engagement process is limited to their 30 seconds at the mic. And what we need is to manage our interrelations on the land. Interrelations of the land means we need an archive that is holding this information with the land itself. That becomes the magic. That becomes where it doesn't matter when they said it. It doesn't matter what language they were speaking. It doesn't matter even if they're still alive. Their information is archived by the property, by the landscape, so that whenever it becomes an issue, that fabric has been accurately located within 220 meters and saying this is relevant to this community here. And that gives a risk mitigation factor for the policy developer, a risk mitigation factor for the developer who wants to bring in a new idea and doesn't want to get community pushback. Here's a clever notion. Use your community narratives, and you know the ones that are the correct ones because the map tells you which ones to use. Make your pitch from the community's own narratives. Now it's their idea. They're not just merely on your side. They will advocate for you because it seems like it's their idea. That becomes a entirely new way to think about how to couch pitching and pitching a new development. If you need to bring research to a community, don't just start, from the academic point of view. Actually go down the question of saying, what do they already understand? Start with their prior understanding. Because if you are trying to educate every member of the polis about what you're doing without starting from what they already know, they're going to start from the position of not trusting what the researcher is proposing as a narrative. But if the researcher has already looked at this community's narratives and starts from that, gives a preamble that says, how your grandfather used to do this and this, your grandfather or someone's grandfather here in this room used to ride the car open top down this road and shout at all the pretty girls on his way to the football game. This is the kind of stuff that we need to talk about for making a better transport network. Is creating opportunities for people to actually enjoy going through the neighborhood. And for that, we're going to need to do some traffic calming because right now the roads are too wide and we need to actually reduce the speeds so that, let's say your grandpa wanted to do that again, or maybe your grandchild wanted to do the same way that grandpa did it. Now, I've taken a real issue of traffic calming and a discussion of how we need to do a road diet in order to make this community more functional. Instead of making it all just my egghead, I have a better education, I can say there's a great reason in your own community why you should do this.
You mentioned AI, and I want to dig a little bit deeper on the AI connections here because I can imagine generative AI and these large language models that are getting better and better, that are becoming multimodal, being able to use the data that you collect to physically map out shared values, which then could have, again, these kinds of positive applications for community. Can you speak a little bit about the future of how you see this data being used right now? And I know we don't have a crystal ball. I know no one can see the future, but this idea of I can identify themes, I can identify values, I can identify story points that help us to bridge the divides that are plaguing our entire world.
So here becomes a whole other story of the Janus Gate. Janus, the two-headed god. And ancient Roman cities would have over the gate to the city, the headstone, the keystone of the archway would be face facing in and a face facing out. that was ruled over by the god Janus. Janus, who represents opportunity, represents bridge building. It's safety within the city. It's unknowns outside of the city. And it is the gate that bridges the two. And to walk through the gate is to take these chances. And a lot of what we're discussing with what the tools that are being developed now represent is a profound new kind of gate that presents us with tremendous opportunities and also perfectly describe all the dangers that lie on the other side as well. The world of the city is bounded by a wall. It's archetypal level. Gate, the portal, the exit, the entrance, being one and the same, becomes the point of question. If someone's going to invade your city, they're going after the gate because it's the weakest point. It's designed to be admitted. It's designed to be open. So that's where you're going to begin. And when we look at a tool that is going to hint at the possibilities of reconsolidating community, it equally has as much potential as well. And so it becomes important to have both conversations about this because of the nature of oral histories and their utility in granting agency to individuals, saying, I'm recording this so that you don't have to come down and say it live. Then that has tremendous power because you are able to speak meaningfully about your own experience, your lived experience. And if that were to be supplanted with a false narrative, that would debase the whole system. One of the things I've been talking about with the EU for 5 years now is saying it is absolutely imperative that these kinds of oral histories not be sampled. That would be a fundamental debasement of an individual's agency, is to make it statistical. That is the literal opposite of my voice on my place about what I've experienced. If that gets sucked into a statistical model and they get averaged out to 100,000 or 1,000,000 people, then by definition, that has lost the power of why we would do it in the first place. And therefore, it becomes a critical component with oral histories to say, this is not meant to be sampled and aggregated into a statistical model, which AI is incredibly powerful at already. And that is the outside gate. That is the wild that we are all concerned about, because that would undo the value that is present in the person's voice. And the person's voice is meant to stand on its own, geographically specific to where it matters for that person, their family, their relations. And allowing that to get loose is very dangerous. I've had multiple conversations with the other researchers in the European Union about saying, we got to put a box around oral history archives, because the whole point of them is that they are personal. And so depersonalizing them would be anathema. At the same time, these new tools that are coming forward could help us bring more of those individual voices to the fore, bring them out and reduce the upfront cost of ethnography, or just consider, and could therefore expand the number of voices that can be contributed, and that would expand their agency. The question is finding a balance within the framework of that system to make sure that there is a definitive cutout, that it can't be copied out to another environment, and also to have a very concise managing organization that has a kill switch that can look at IP traffic and say, I just got 30 data requests from the same IP, and they didn't make a request. Shut down the entire system. There is nothing that can not be done tomorrow in the realm of oral histories and ethnography. It's history. It can happen tomorrow as well. Let us all take a pause. Let's look at the server flow and see where the traffic is going. And let's make sure that some bad actor is not trying to debase.
It's difficult because even if you put these things in an anthology, you have a large language model or an AI that is choosing the voices to be elevated. And that too seems to violate the notion of purity that you just described. Where is the line then? If a large language model or an AI is promoting specific stories that are pulled from an archive, isn't that also taking away agency from others who maybe weren't promoted or chosen by the AI? And would you also want to prohibit that kind of action as well to help get these stories out?
The real chimera is the fact that the AIs are training themselves. And so what you have is a conversation that needs to go back to the foundation of politics. And the foundation of politics is to really address the question of how do we create opportunities for the future generation to realize their own potential without running amok, offer them a degree of conservatism so that there is not change too fast, but absolutely The next generation must bring forward what they need, and they will know what they need. They're going to be the ones who are going to define that. And when you start using an algorithm that has trained itself entirely on past data, it's going to start creating patterns in political discourse that are not fundamentally nasal. They're not new. They're not coming forward from the lived needs of the next generation. It's algorithmically derived from the past what should be the voices to elevate. That literally inverts the whole point of creating a new world going forward. It's literally couching entirely from a conservative point of view. And while some of that is necessary, that needs to be obvious and it needs to be auditable. You need to be able to explain yourself. Well, we have tried that kind of crazy idea before. The results were this, and that's why we're not going to greenlight your project, because we know that didn't go well before. A language model doesn't have the ability to say why it made a decision. It can give you references of where it's pulling information from, but its network of decision-making patterns, it learned itself, and we can't audit them efficiently or at all in some cases. And so from that perspective is it's an inversion on what the whole point of what working with politics is. So a macro narrative that is brought forward by a algorithm that is trained on past narratives, by definition, is not the new narrative. It's an approximation based off of old data. And that fundamentally removes the potential and the viability of the upcoming generation, because it's not their voice. It's not their ideas. It's something that is built on past structures, and we can't even audit it. That becomes the defining line to say, if you're trying to manufacture a city with a entirely reverse looking point of view, it can't succeed. It will be outperformed by cities that are using the old system of a balance between conservatism and natality, of bringing forward the new. Those other cities on the old system will simply outperform any city that is based entirely in a conservative point of view, which is, in other words, trained on old data. It will not be as successful a city. People will look for opportunities in these cities where the rules are not written by some unknown chimera, and they can experience and express their own ideas and realize them, fail, or maybe succeed. They'll go to those places where they can realize the best. It's avoiding a tyranny of concept, and people will naturally do that on their own. So there's no value long-term to using those kinds of aggregate methods, because places that don't use it will simply do better. They'll provide better opportunities, and people will move there. They'll vote with their feet.
It sounds like you're describing authenticity and the power of authenticity in our stories. And whenever you strip away that authenticity and you make it something else, as marketers, we might do to speak to an audience, or digital communicators, we might do to speak to a specific group of people, you're robbing that authenticity. And it also speaks to why I think some of these platforms are doing better than other platforms that are less authentic. We've seen a rise in social media of authentic stories beating these highly produced stories. And that needle may swing back and forth, but if the story is authentic, it doesn't really matter, does it? Can you speak to authenticity and the role that authentic storytelling plays in your work?
There's two worlds that we're discussing here, and we need to get that aired out, which is the politic is not the same thing as the marketing. And marketing is about suggesting that there's something missing in your life, and this thing right here is going to close the gap for you. And that is often about pragmatism. If it's honest, it's saying, honestly, you need to go 180 miles per hour in an all electric vehicle, or else how will you get to work on time? It's like, alternatively, you could say, you will look so sexy in our latest electrical vehicle, and you want to own this identity so that you get more attention from your peers, more respect from your children, and more dates on the dating app, right? And that's an identity pitch that you're literally trying to sell someone's identity, as opposed to the politic, where it's very much about respecting identities as they are arising in the environment, honoring that, and making that the foundation of where you're coming from, because anything else is subversion, which is the point of marketing, is to say, you're missing something and you should change it to do this. The politics says exactly the opposite. Say, you are who you have worked hard to be who you what do you need to succeed? What do you need for your family to succeed? And fundamentally, in continuity with what you already understand. That does bring forward their bias. That does bring forward their past problems. That does bring forward their past traumas. The question of authenticity. That is who they are. And if you suggest that they abandon who they are to become some new super person, that falls flat real fast. People want to be respected for who they are. That is what freedom by definition is to be who you are and to be respected and to be listened to. That's it. Now that we've made our two worlds here of convincing people that they're not complete or honoring people and telling them they are complete and how should we go forward as a community, then the question of authenticity comes down to not manipulating people's voice, but to use them when appropriate. And of course, that's why I use the geographical, saying, obviously, the following stories are relevant to the conversation. I'm going to bring forward the following, maybe a paragraph each. Some of the oral history probably ranged all over the city, but they spoke about this particular street corner for a grand whole 30 seconds that produced this much copy. We will include that then in our discussion. We will then use that to couch where we're coming from. And hopefully more than one storyteller spoke to that environment, and therefore we will include all of the relevant voices. And then dot, dot, dot. Therefore, we as professionals suggest the following based on that. Fundamentally, it says, I'm not going to rely on my university education to tell the community what to do. I'm going to have the community describe their authentic memories, their actual lived memories, and from that, base a proposal with the goal being the metric that we need to move on a macro scale. But we're going to do it using the community's local ideas or their memories so that we're not just dismissing them, because the authenticity goes both ways. I can definitely confuse people with all kinds of propaganda kind of statements. I can leverage their social media silos and it will have their identity flattered. And that's what social media siloing does, is that it makes people feel that they're part of some kind of a movement, that they're doing something important. Leverage that. Don't go from a macro scale analysis of whether they're doing something important. Talk to what they already have accomplished and say, what you've already accomplished is important, and we're going to base our proposals on it.
It sounds like really hard work to be able to sift through a large amount of stories, listen or read transcribed stories, and then base policy decisions on that. But I know that there's a payoff. Can you speak a little bit about the payoff and the success of these kinds of initiatives whenever you do take authentic stories into account and you pull them through, and instead of turning it into propaganda or turning it into something that isn't the will of the people, actually affirming the will of the people to create and give them something that they actually want, as opposed to something that maybe more powerful interests want?
One important thing to look at is how it was done before, because prior to the Industrial Revolution, cities evolved very, very slowly, and they evolved incrementally at a very fine detail. And this has been turned into the foundation of Europe's tourism industry, is that their communities have been evolved at a very slow pace. And so the fit is precise. There's always rough edges, but a lot of them have been shaved off. They're very commodious. You can walk around them because they were designed without reference to the automobile, and they are evolved creatures in place that is the result of 1,001 stories told by literally thousands of people over 1,000 years, each one of them slowly evolving what came before to adapt, update, and to make it more commodious. All the churches around me where I live right now are all between 3 and 5 feet below grade. And that's because they've added layers to the streets over the last 700 years. And the churches are sitting at grade as of 700 years ago. And the modern buildings are all about 4 feet up because of the layers of the street that have been added. That's not just asphalt. That's also plumbing and electrical and fire system. As they've adapted it, it's created a quirk in that you have to step down into every church, which is a little weird. But at the same time, that's the reminder that there is a past, that there is something that came before us. It's something that is not common in the New World. United States, everything is not 20, 50, 60 years old at the most. So that sense of the continuity outside your window it's difficult to identify. Historic associations have worked hard to try and bring something, save something from the past. It's not all just shiny new world, but that there's that breach of continuity backwards so that someone sitting in a community can see that where they live has a meaning beyond their own life. And therefore, the common existential crisis is at least mitigated to a degree by demonstrating that their community will survive them. And since you can't know the future, the only thing you can offer is a past. And if you can show that past stretching back behind them, then you mitigate that quality of it's all meaningless. Nothing that I do matters. And I might as well just turn on my video games and shut the windows. And if I get a job offer from the far side of the country, I'll take it. I have no desire to stay here for any particular reason. I have some friends, but I got Facebook and we can Zoom anytime. I don't have any attachment to this locality because they'll experience that sense of continuity. And that becomes the litmus test for whether someone is entirely future focused, which is propagandic, saying you need to accomplish this, so on and so forth. If it's not going to be balanced between the past and a promise of between conservatism and hope, then a message by that basic, definition is not leveraging what is already there and not being critical. You need to do both because that's how cities evolve, is you actually look at what's not correct and take an opportunity to fix that. Maybe that might be a market opportunity. So I'm going to introduce a new business opportunity for the community. And I'm going to do it in such a way that makes it look like it's always been here or it was always going to happen anyway. Now the community's on your side. Now the community doesn't feel like they're being manipulated. You're actually doing the respectful, using their past to create the future. In the same way, when you write a book, it doesn't make sense to have every chapter be a completely new story. It has to be tied into the previous chapter. Paragraphs have to be linked together. And how many times do you get a paper from a student and they just completely change direction in the middle of their paper? And it's like, oh, this is a separate subject. And that's exactly how communities feel as well. If you don't actually make the connection, if you don't consciously make that connection, if you don't say, we leverage the community's narratives for this particular location that are already there, we're going to show them to you, here's their narratives, then you didn't do your due diligence. You didn't take that up. If there's not enough stories or there's only a certain number or a certain bias in the stories, that's a wake-up call to the rest of the community going, you haven't collected enough of your stories and you might as well. And it's got a long-term payoff. I mean, it's going to affect the current issue that you care about. So get your narrative recorded. But also in 20 years, there may be another subject, maybe not even at that street corner, maybe another half mile down the block. That will be viable then as well. So why not go ahead and close the data gap, bring the rest of those stories to the fore?
Climate change. You are thinking years and years into the future. All of our scientists have consensus that our world is going to get warmer. How can storytelling help us as we move into the future? And I remember you had discussed a story that was very old that had been impacted by climate change. Can you share that story and maybe use that as a guide to tell us how we can prepare for the future?
There's a tradition of storytelling. I think you're talking about Australia. In Australia, it's just got one of the oldest cultures on the planet. And the Aboriginal tribes there's a tremendous variety amongst them. But one of the technologies they developed a very long time ago was to create song lines across the entire continent. And what a song line does is as you're walking along, you sing the story in the song. And if you're going in the right direction, the characters in the story are actually the landscape around you. So as you're discussing the turtle, a hill, you will come over the horizon and there will be a hill that is the turtle in the story. So you're going the right direction. And this was an ancient map, and they had thousands of these songs. And as a song we know, and they would realize that they actually share a common map, and that would then allow them to bifurcate their own map and travel across the community or travel across the continent. And some researchers were following one of these song lines in 2013 and were just having a wonderful time and suddenly found themselves standing at the edge of the ocean. But they still had song left to sing, but there was no landforms. And after they thought about it a little while, they thought maybe those landforms are simply under the water, Sure enough, it looked on the oceanographic charts. There was the rest of the landforms. That means that when this song was created, that land was dry. And for that land to have been dry, it had to have been back during the Pleistocene Ice Age, when the sea level was 20 or 50 meters lower, which means the story predates the last ice age. That predates the Roman Empire, that predates the Egyptian Empire, the Hittites, Babylon, everything else we have recorded as history. This one story that two researchers were just walking along following predates all the rest of the written history, or even history in stones. And so here we have this ancient technology of storytelling as a tool, still useful and geographically accurate, that becomes a bridge for a community to actually talk about deep time. And here we are talking about a 1,000-year project of how can we make a project that would last 1,000 years? Here's an example of something that is at least 6,000, 7,000. If we're going to talk about a long-term relationship of human beings with the planet, it's going to involve stories, and stories that are going to help us in the short term and in the long term. In the short term, in the immediate situation, we're probably going to be experiencing between 100 to 150 million displaced people by 2050, based off sea level rise. That much of humanity is already living at the sea, and it takes a 2-meter level rise to disable the plumbing systems for all of those cities. Those cities will be inviable, and people are going to relocate inland. That's going to mean a mixture of new settlements, which will probably happen, but initially, a whole lot of refugees, climate refugees by the tens of millions. Currently, we have 200 million migrants on the planet right now. And as of 2022, when they arrive at a community, they don't know anything. They don't know where the grocery is. They don't know what are the right places to go at nighttime. They don't have any of the backstory that would let them understand the community that they are now moving to. And at the same time, you have the people who live there who really know who they are and are not really interested in this new group of people who are moving and taking over their community and supplanting culture and so on and so forth. And so there's a natural resistance to migration, and there's a natural resistance to immigration. One thing that would make a huge difference for both camps would be if the native community who lives there, the indigenous peoples, the emplaced people, recorded their stories, put it on the map, put a flag in the ground and said, this is who we are. Here's the meanings of why things are the way they are, why we believe what we believe, and then offer that story in a format that can be translated by auto-translate systems, that is geographically accurate, so that it's not just random. It's actually, this is your neighborhood. Okay, here's the stories from your new neighborhood. Now the person who's moved to the neighborhood can understand why things are the way they are. And since they're going to be sharing the land, since they're going to have common interests, they'll understand a little bit better the value systems that the other people are bringing forward. At the same time, the new arrival can then begin their process of building memories in their new home, recording their stories. Not initially, but as they've lived there for a while, they then add their story. This has what's been happening all the time. Just now we can visualize it. We can show it, and we can make it much more accessible to both sides of the equation, so that we can improve community integration as we have climate-related migration, which is going to happen. It's already happening. Climate migration is going to be part of conflict migration, because you're going to have resource contests that's going to result in new conflicts. So it really becomes a general purpose tool that the community that is already there can grab a sense of continuity, offer that in a non-confrontational format to new arrivals who may not even speak the language, but the translate systems will do that for them. And so these, when they come together, they're not foreigners to one another.
That is exciting. Can you connect that to Denver and the work you're doing in Denver? How does Australia connect with Denver? Those are really far apart.
They're far apart. What's interesting, of course, is that humanity lives on a planet. And so whether you're in Australia or whether you're in Denver or you're in Cyprus or you're in San Antonio, there is a common set of conditions that humans all have to engage with. And narrative infrastructure, as I've conceived it, works at a macro level with 6 fundamental conditions. 3 of them I took wholesale from the political theory of Hannah Arendt. I worked into an ontological relationship with 3 other senses of what bridges the ideas of labor, work, and action. which is Hannah Arendt's fundamental concept. We have to create things that need to endure, like works, buildings, art, law. Those things need to endure. Those are the works of the community. The labors of the community are what you need to survive. You need bread, you need children, you need clean towels, you need to clean up your messes. And that's fundamental to daily life, is you have to make things that are not going to last, but are necessary. And then we need, if we're a political organization or political body, we need to act. We need to be able to talk to one another. We need to be able to come to decisions. We need to be able to make promises, and we need to be able to apologize. That is the political realm. Within that three trifecta, really, that Hannah Arendt brought forward, then there's also the question of where we live. That's more or less defined between where we labor and where we work. That's our domain. That's where we go to church. That's where we walk to and fro. That is where we feel safe, fundamentally. That's where we would call our house, our domos, as the Greeks would say, the domain itself. Our identity is we want others to think who we are beyond our physical self. The identity, as we've been mispronouncing it for a couple of thousand years now, identity is what we name outside of ourselves that we want others to associate with us. Identity. Freud called it the id. It's what we desire others to think of us. And how we formulate that is how we manifest our desires to be within that domain. And then everything has to be somewhat meaningful, or otherwise, what does it all matter? And why get up? Why go to work? Why clean my teeth? Well, things mean things. You take the average of all the different problems you have in your life, trace a line between them, find the mean. That's the meaning of your life. It's the mean line between those issues. That is how we find means and meaning. And that structure of ideas is applicable to human beings wherever they happen to set up shop, however you create a city. Denver has a relatively recent history. The city I live in right now is 700 years old. Denver, not quite. 140 years of people on the land working at that equation of laboring to stay alive, working and building structures, and then making decisions and making promises to one another. And Denver did something very unique under the previous mayor's office, which was to create an office of city storytelling. And they've been collecting community narratives and using those to frame issues locally by gathering interviews and then turning those into videos that is then used in addition to discussing current political issues, which has been very successful and is been a wonderful idea. I've been coordinating with the director of that office to talk about making a new offering to the local political leadership and the local NGOs, particularly those facing with migrant issues. Denver is facing migrant issues very directly, particularly with combined with a housing shortage, so that they have a dramatic homeless increase. Having the ability for people to land in a new community and get that sense of the local values is going to dramatically increase the potential for them to share those values and be able to have a reasonable political discourse. And until a new person is engaged in the local politics, they're not acting as a citizen. You can work there, you can labor there, but you're not of there until you have a political engagement there. You have to be able to act to be integrated. That's the final issue that has to be resolved. So using narratives as the starting point for the conversation to allow the situated people who've been there a generation, 2 generations, to be able to express what their desires are for continuity, allows the newcomer to be able to feel that they can find new opportunities in that framework. So they build on the stories that are already there, established in Denver, and honor what has come before while bringing something that is vital, that is important, which is new ideas, innovations, and cities that don't innovate fail. And so that becomes a way to increase the potential for communities to accomplish integration is by sharing narratives and creating the promise of allowing people who have arrived to contribute their own.
Excellent. Jason, thank you so much for joining us. Please share where people can find you online and be sure to spell it out for our listening audience.
My research is pretty much all going to be all organized at narrativeinfrastructure.org, and the longest URL I could possibly come up with.
They can find it all on narrativeinfrastructure.org.
Yes, and the archives are all live on that website, so you can explore the narrative infrastructures that have already been created for Famagusta, Cyprus, and Denver, Colorado.
you.